My girlfriend. Said I'd never be successful, so I left quietly and made my first million before her birthday. I'm a 29-year-old guy who always believed hard work could change my life. I didn't come from money or connections, just grit and a stubborn belief that if I worked hard enough, something good would eventually happen. Back then, I was juggling freelance jobs, skipping meals to save cash, and sleeping 5 hours a night on a second-hand couch. That's when I met Amber. She was everything I thought I needed, steady, grounded, with a 9-to-5 that actually paid her bills. When she smiled at me that first night at a friend's dinner party, I remember thinking, she's out of my league. But she liked my ambition. She said it reminded her of the fire people lose once they get comfortable. For a while, her faith in me felt like oxygen. When I'd talk about building something of my own, she'd say, "You'll make it happen, babe. You've got that spark." And I believed her. We moved in together after a year, and life felt stable. She'd leave for work in her neatly pressed office clothes while I worked from our cramped kitchen table, laptop overheating as I sent cold emails and drafted business ideas. But slowly that warmth began to cool. She'd sigh when I talked about my projects. When I showed her sketches for my startup's logo, she laughed softly and said, "You're cute when you play entrepreneur." At first I told myself it was a joke. But those jokes started coming more often, sharper each time. "Maybe you should get a real job," she'd say, half smiling. "At least until this fantasy of yours pays off." Every word dug deeper than she realized. Her laughter started echoing louder than my own confidence. And one night, staring at my reflection in our dark kitchen window, I realized something painful. The woman who once believed in me now sounded exactly like the world I was trying to prove wrong. Amber didn't tear me down all at once. It happened slowly, like erosion. One day it was a joke. The next it was a sigh. Then eventually, silence whenever I mentioned anything that didn't involve her plans. At first I brushed it off. I told myself she was just tired, stressed, or maybe scared of uncertainty. But deep down, I started noticing how she only smiled when other people succeeded. We'd go to her co-workers' gatherings, people with stable salaries, shiny cars, and stories about company bonuses. She'd introduce me as a freelancer, like the word entrepreneur embarrassed her. Once her friend asked what I did for a living, and before I could answer, Amber laughed and said, "He's trying to start something." "We're still waiting for it to work." Everyone chuckled. I laughed too, but my chest burned the whole night. At home, it got worse. I'd stay up late researching, building prototypes, trying to make progress. She'd lean against the doorway and say, "You know, most guys your age are already managers or married. You're still figuring things out." I'd tell her, "That's what building something looks like," and she'd roll her eyes. "Sure, babe. Just don't burn yourself out over imaginary success." I started hiding my excitement from her. When I landed a small client, I didn't tell her. When I hit a new milestone in my project, I celebrated alone with a cup of instant coffee. I stopped showing her my ideas altogether, but silence has a way of filling the room. I could feel the distance growing like a crack in glass, small, invisible, but spreading. And one night, as she scrolled on her phone beside me, laughing at some influencer couple who finally made it, I realized something brutal. She didn't just doubt me. She enjoyed reminding me of it. It all came to a head one night at dinner with Amber's friends. We were at this trendy rooftop place she'd been begging to try, low lighting, overpriced wine, the kind of place where people brag about their career journeys. I remember sitting there, listening to her friends talk about promotions and salary hikes while I quietly sipped water, trying not to feel like a failure. Then someone asked how my little project was going. Before I could answer, Amber smirked and said, "Oh, that? He's still playing startup." Laughter rippled around the table. She leaned closer, adding, "He's determined, though. I keep telling him he should just get a normal job before we starve." I froze. Her friends laughed again, but I caught one of them glancing at me with pity, like I was some helpless dreamer she was tolerating. My throat went dry, my stomach twisted. I wanted to say something, anything. But I just sat there, swallowing the humiliation while she basked in their laughter. On the drive home, I stared out the window in silence. Amber hummed along to the radio like nothing happened. I finally said, "Did you really have to say that?" She scoffed. "Oh, come on. It was a joke. Don't be so sensitive." "That wasn't a joke," I said quietly. "You made me look like a joke." She rolled her eyes. "If you're that insecure, maybe that's on you." That line hit harder than any insult she'd ever thrown. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed that night, watching her scroll through her phone, laughing at memes, completely unaffected. Something in me cracked open, a silent realization that she didn't see me as a partner. I was just a placeholder until someone more established came along, and for the first time, I stopped defending her in my head. After that dinner, something inside me switched. I stopped waiting for her validation. I stopped trying to explain myself. I realized that if I wanted to succeed, I had to do it in spite of her, not with her. Days blurred into nights. I'd wake up before sunrise, make cheap instant coffee and work until my eyes burned. The apartment would be quiet, except for the hum of my laptop fan and the faint sound of Amber's hairdryer in the other room. She'd walk past me in her neatly pressed blazer, glancing at my cluttered desk like it was a pile of failure. "You're still at it?" she'd say, half amused. "Don't you ever get tired of chasing ghosts?" I didn't answer anymore. I'd just nod, pretending her words didn't sting. But each one stuck like a splinter, pushing me harder. I learned coding tutorials by day, networked online by night, and took freelance gigs that barely paid just to keep the lights on. When Amber complained about my boring routine, I smiled and told her I was fine. But I wasn't. I was lonely, exhausted, and drowning in self-doubt. Every night, I'd lie awake listening to her breathing beside me, wondering if she'd ever loved me, or just the idea of fixing me. The air between us grew heavier. Her laughter felt foreign now, her affection distant and mechanical. One night, after she mocked my latest pitch idea, I turned off my screen and just stared at her. The woman I once thought was my biggest supporter now looked like the wall standing between me and the life I wanted. I didn't say it out loud, but I made a promise to myself right then. If I was going to fail, I'd do it on my own terms, and if I was going to win, she'd never see it coming. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday night. Amber was in the shower when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. I wasn't the type to snoop, but something about the preview caught my eye. A message from her friend, Melissa. "He's still chasing that app thing?" You must have the patience of a saint. Curiosity turned to a pit in my stomach. Against my better judgment, I opened the thread. And there it was, a running joke at my expense. Message after message mocking me. He actually thinks he'll be a CEO someday. It's kind of cute how delusional he is. At least he's good for rent until you find someone serious. I remember staring at the screen, my heart pounding, the sound of the shower in the background like white noise to my shock. My girlfriend, the woman I loved, was laughing at me behind my back. All those nights I thought she was just tired or frustrated. She was entertained. I locked her phone, placed it back, and sat there in silence. When she came out, towel wrapped around her hair, she smiled and said, "Why do you look weird?" "Nothing," I muttered. But something died inside me that night. Over the next few days, I couldn't look at her the same. Her laughter sounded hollow, her affection rehearsed. I noticed more things. How she'd text constantly during dinner. How she'd change the topic when I mentioned future plans. One night, when I couldn't hold it in, I asked her straight out, "Why are you even with me?" She looked up from her phone, unbothered. "Because you're safe," she said casually. "You'll never outgrow me." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That was the night I stopped being heartbroken and started being dangerous. I didn't yell. I didn't leave. I just smiled faintly, turned back to my laptop and thought, all right, let's see how wrong you are. After that night, something in me went cold. I stopped reacting to her words, stopped seeking her approval, and started building my silence into a weapon. Amber thought she'd broken me. What she didn't know was that she'd just given me the reason to burn through every ounce of fear I had left. I opened a new bank account she didn't know about and began saving every cent from my freelance gigs. I took on extra clients, even the impossible ones, working late into the night while she slept. I rented a small studio across town under a friend's name, telling her I was helping with a project. It became my second home. 4 white walls, a cheap desk, and a laptop that overheated every 2 hours. But in that little room, I felt more alive than I ever did in our shared apartment. Every insult she'd thrown at me became fuel. Every sigh, every eye roll, kindling. I didn't argue anymore when she called me a dreamer. I just smiled and said, "You're right." It disarmed her, confused her. She'd scoff and walk away, not realizing that while she mocked, I was quietly laying bricks for the life she said I'd never have. Some nights, exhaustion would catch up with me. I'd stare at the flickering cursor on my screen, my hands trembling from too much coffee and too little sleep. The weight of her words would creep in, "You'll never outgrow me." But then I'd think about the message thread I read that night. The laughter. The betrayal. And suddenly, sleep didn't matter anymore. I wasn't staying because I was weak. I was staying to finish the masterpiece of my escape. And when I finally walked out of her life, she wasn't going to hear the door slam. She was going to hear my name everywhere she went. Months passed, and the world outside our apartment kept spinning while I built mine in secret. My app, something I'd once scribbled on a napkin, was finally starting to take shape. The late nights, the coding errors, the endless rejections, it all began to pay off. A small company reached out, offering to test a beta version, then another. And before I knew it, I had paying users. It wasn't much, but it was real. I remember sitting at my desk one morning, watching the first $500 deposit hit my new account. My hands shook. I wanted to tell someone, her even, but I stopped myself. She didn't deserve to know. When Amber walked in, complaining about how we never go anywhere anymore, I just smiled and said, "You're right." "We don't," she rolled her eyes. "God, you're impossible sometimes." I didn't argue. I didn't tell her that while she was scrolling through vacation photos of other couples, I was closing my first investor meeting. I started dressing a little better, talking a little less, moving with quiet purpose. She thought I was still lost in my little dream. But the truth was, I was already halfway out of her world. A few weeks later, when she accused me of drifting away, I said, "I guess I'm just tired of feeling small." She laughed and replied, "Then stop pretending you're meant for more." I looked at her for a long time, at the woman who once made me feel seen, now trying to keep me beneath her. In that moment, I realized something freeing. She wasn't my anchor, she was my weight, and the best part? She had no idea I was already cutting the rope. Success has a strange way of revealing people. The more focused I became, the more erratic Amber got. She'd come home late, dressed up, smelling like expensive perfume that wasn't hers. When I asked where she'd been, she'd scoff, "Out with coworkers." Sorry, some of us actually work for a living. I bit my tongue. I didn't want to fight, not yet. Then one night, I came home early from my studio. Her car was in the driveway, but the lights were low. I walked in and found her pacing the living room, phone pressed to her ear. "No, he's harmless," she said, laughing softly. "He still thinks he's building the next big thing. I give it 6 months before he's begging for a real job." I froze in the hallway. I'd heard enough. The woman I loved wasn't just doubting me. She was mocking me to someone else. Maybe another guy. Maybe one of the same friends who laughed that night at dinner. When she hung up and saw me standing there, she flinched. "How much did you hear?" she asked. "Enough," I said quietly. Her tone shifted instantly. It was a joke. "You're too sensitive." I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just looked at her, the person who'd been beside me through years of struggle, and realized she wasn't beside me at all. She was standing in my way. The next morning, she woke up to an empty closet. No yelling, no goodbye note, no dramatic scene. Just silence, and a single sticky note on the fridge that read, "You were right. I'll never be successful with you." I walked out carrying nothing but my laptop and a backpack, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't chasing approval, I was chasing freedom. The days after I left were quiet, too quiet. No more sarcastic laughter, no passive-aggressive sighs, no one asking when I'd get a real job. Just me, my laptop, and the echo of my own thoughts bouncing off the bare walls of that tiny studio. At first, the silence was suffocating. I'd lie awake at night, questioning everything. Had I overreacted? Was I really the problem? But then I'd remember her voice, that smug confidence when she said I'd never outgrow her, and my resolve would harden all over again. I poured everything I had into my work. Every fear, every ounce of pain, every late-night flashback became energy. My world shrank to a rhythm of coding, pitching, emailing, and surviving. I ate cheap takeout, wore the same clothes for days, and lost track of weekends. There were no friends left to celebrate with. I distanced everyone during those toxic years with her. Then one morning, I opened my email and froze. A venture fund wanted to meet. They'd seen my beta version and were intrigued. My heart raced as I walked into that meeting, wearing a borrowed suit and a determination they couldn't ignore. 3 months later, the deal closed. My app officially became a funded startup. 6 figures, real, tangible, life-changing money hit my account. I stared at the screen, trembling. I wasn't rich yet, but I'd crossed a line she swore I never would. Still, success didn't feel like I imagined. The nights were long, the loneliness sharp. Sometimes I'd catch myself wanting to tell her, to shove the proof in her face. But I didn't. Not yet, because somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of her realization. You'd think success would fix everything, but it didn't. After the first wave of funding, I threw myself into work even harder, desperate to keep the momentum alive. Investors wanted results, clients demanded updates, and every day felt like a sprint with no finish line. I told myself this was what freedom looked like, exhaustion with a purpose. But in truth, I was falling apart. I'd wake up at my desk, half-eaten meals beside me, heart racing from caffeine and stress. My friends reached out, but I barely replied. I didn't even have anyone to share my victories with. When I made my first 6-figure profit, I celebrated alone in silence, sitting on the floor of that studio with a takeout box and cold coffee. The loneliness hit me harder than poverty ever did. Then came the panic attack. It happened during a pitch meeting. My mind just went blank. The words vanished. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. Everyone in the room blurred into background noise. I excused myself and locked myself in the restroom, staring into the mirror at a stranger. Bloodshot eyes, trembling hands, dark circles. I had become the very thing Amber accused me of. Obsessed, consumed, hollow. That night, for the first time in years, I closed my laptop before midnight. I stepped outside the studio, breathing in the cold night air, feeling the city hum around me. And in that stillness, it hit me. I didn't need to destroy myself to prove her wrong. I'd already done that. What I needed now wasn't revenge, it was peace. So I made a decision. I hired a team, delegated responsibilities, and started rebuilding my life. I began to exist again, not as the man she mocked, but as the man I always wanted to be. Still, I couldn't shake one thought. She hadn't seen any of it yet. It had been nearly 2 years since I'd last seen Amber when the invitation came. A mutual friend texted me out of nowhere. "Hey, we're doing a little get-together for Amber's 30th. You should come." At first, I almost ignored it. But something in me, the part that still remembered her laughter echoing over my humiliation, told me to go. Not for revenge, for closure. The night of the dinner, I walked in quietly. Same group of friends, same restaurant, but I wasn't the same man. My worn-out hoodies had been replaced with a tailored jacket, my anxious energy with calm confidence. When Amber saw me, her smile froze mid-sentence. She blinked twice as if trying to place me. "Wow," she finally said, her voice tight. "You look different." "Life's been good," I said simply. We all sat down, and conversation flowed, mostly small talk, gossip, meaningless chatter. But eventually, one of her friends turned to me. "So what are you up to these days?" Before I could answer, another chimed in. "You didn't see? His company was just featured in Forbes." Amber's fork clattered against her plate. I smiled politely. "It's still early. Just trying to build something sustainable." Her face was a mixture of shock and forced composure. She leaned in slightly and said, "I always knew you'd do something great." I met her eyes and replied softly, "No, you didn't. But that's okay." Silence filled the table. She laughed nervously, reaching for her drink, but I'd already moved on, engaging in conversation with someone else. By the time dessert came, she looked smaller somehow, quieter, and as I stood to leave, she said, almost a whisper, "You really proved me wrong, didn't you?" I paused, smiled faintly, and said, "I didn't do it to prove you wrong. I did it to prove me right." Then I walked away, leaving her sitting in the life she'd chosen, watching the man she said would never make it disappear into success. After that night, something inside me settled. There was no rush of victory, no cinematic sense of triumph, just quiet peace. The revenge had already happened long before that dinner. It wasn't in the money or the recognition or the headlines. It was in the man I became while no one was watching. In the weeks that followed, I kept building, but this time without obsession. I started mentoring younger entrepreneurs, people like me who'd been told they'd never make it. I funded small scholarships, donated laptops to kids with dreams bigger than their circumstances. Every time I saw one of them light up with hope, it felt better than any dollar I'd earned. Sometimes Amber's name would come up in mutual circles. Word was she'd dated a few men with real jobs, but none of it lasted. I never smiled at that news. I didn't need her failure to validate my success. What she took from me, my self-belief, my confidence, I'd rebuilt stronger than before. One evening, I walked past the old apartment we once shared. The lights were off, the building a little older, the paint faded. I stood there for a moment, remembering the man I was when I lived inside those walls, tired, small, desperate for approval. Then I turned away, smiling quietly. She taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. Sometimes love doesn't break you. It reveals what was weak enough to bend. And if you rebuild right, no one can ever bend you again. So no, I never texted her, never flaunted the success she doubted. Because the best revenge isn't showing them what they lost. It's living so far above the version of yourself they tried to destroy. They wouldn't even recognize you if they saw you again. And that's exactly what I became.